my whole racing journey started back in 2012. We went to the Chicago Auto Show with some friends, namely my friend Antoine, um, who's quite a more popular racing person now. And yeah, like back then we just liked cars, or we just wanted to go check out some really nice cars. So we'd go there and like, oh, these are really cool cars. And I think we also tried out one of those racing simulators, and that's how this all started. Like we went there, we thought these cars were really cool, and I had a PlayStation at the time, and so we went on Craigslist. We found a racing simulator. It had like a seat and also the steering wheels and everything attached. And on Craigslist it was like $300. So we went to this like some northern Chicago suburb, brought home this racing simulator, and that's how we started playing Gran Turismo at our house parties all the time, and that was really fun. So that's how I started with all this racing stuff back in 2012. And after a year after that, I would drive my car on the track. I had an IS 250 all-wheel drive. It wasn't meant to be a track car, and I think on my first day out, I burned the tires, burned the brakes, burned the pads, destroyed basically everything out of the car. Had to get the car towed back to the dealership because I couldn't drive it. Like the brakes were completely gone. It was actually quite funny because I remember at the track day they told us, "Hey, don't spray water onto your brakes," and I totally did that. And basically everything that you could do wrong in your first track day, that's what I did. But it was fun. It was a lot of fun, and I think to this day, I think that car that car actually could have been the most expensive car I've ever tracked on a per hour basis, which we'll talk about later in this video. And but yeah, after that I started driving go-karts. I spent a year driving go-karts in Michiana, and that was really great because you could just go there, drive all day. I think the longest we drove, like there was one day where I drove 4 hours straight, and maybe with with half an hour breaks in between, but we had like 4 hours of track time. It was on a weekday. It was like on Wednesday in like July, and so no one else was there, and that was a lot of fun. And then after a year out of carts, I got a car. I got a Porsche Boxster, and I was like, okay, now I'm going to do track driving like with a sports car, and it'll be good. And what we ended up finding out was that like over time, we would drive 2 hours, 3 hours to Michigan or Indiana, rent a hotel, and we started tabulating all the costs, and we started realizing that like a lot of the costs of driving, it started to add up in places that you wouldn't really expect, right? Like, everyone expects to pay gas, everyone expects to pay tires, but if you think about track fees, also the hotel costs, we started like, given that we're pretty financial people, we'd look at the costs and be like, okay, let's try to see if we can save the costs by not having to drive 3 hours away and having to rent a hotel. And so we joined Autobahn Country Club in Joliet, which we thought was a good deal because it was like the membership that back then wasn't that much, and also given the annual fees, it worked out that it would be equivalent to if we just did track driving at Autobahn instead of in Putnam Park in Indiana, we would have saved probably, if we just went there 10 days a year, we figured we'd break even, and 10 days a year is not really that much considering how much we were driving back then. So we joined Autobahn to save money, and unfortunately I don't think we actually ended up saving any money, but it was a great experience, and having a local track, being able to enjoy driving all the time really made me really happy. Yeah, and then having that confidence to go there and just really work on it and get better. And I think the great thing about driving is that the community is really good. Everyone that you meet, they're all really supportive. They've always been where you are, and they really want you to learn and grow at your own pace. So yeah, at Autobahn it was really great. I met a lot of great people, and I'm still friends with all of them right now. And the great thing about Autobahn is that you kind of go there and drive as much as you want. Now, if me and Antoine were driving, he had an M3 at the time, and I had a Porsche Boxster, and we were driving on the track, and I tried to, it's a long story, but I ended up blowing up the engine of my car, yeah, I'll tell that story another time. But in that time, we kept seeing these Formula cars drive by, and it was like, oh, let's just try that. So we ended up getting into open wheel racing, and then I moved at Autobahn, and that was a really good experience, especially learning how to drive an open wheel car. it made me a much better as a driver. And when I moved to China for work the next year in 2015, I got to drive in Formula Renault, and did a professional race in Formula 4, and that was a lot of fun as well. And you start to kind of like see the differences between the track driving, go-karting, and professional racing, and it's quite a big difference. And as we'll talk about, also quite a big difference in cost as well. So after my time in China, I moved back to America and back in Chicago. This was 2017. I bought myself a Radical SR3, and we have a really good league at Autobahn for the Radicals, and so I spent a lot of time driving Autobahn, and did a lot of races. I did also a race at Laguna Seca for the National Series, and the Radical is a great car. It's pretty reliable, and it's something that like is really fit for like weekend driving. It's for someone that like doesn't really want to necessarily do pro racing at this moment, but really good for practice, and it's generally quite a fun car to drive. So the general progression about how I started racing was sim racing, go-karting, street driving, then open lapping with for open wheel cars, and then also professional racing. And so the first step that I talked about in terms of cost of racing is sim racing. So sim racing is probably the same racing that everyone has done in their past, and I can't imagine anyone that hasn't done it. I did this when I was like 10 years old or 15 years old in high school, playing with my friends on their PlayStation 2, playing Gran Turismo, and that was the best type of racing. And also like it's also a really good way to practice. It's the best way to learn the basics of like the line, what it means to actually drive around the track. It's very different than street driving, and that's why also a lot of professionals use sim racing. It's the best way to learn a new track without having ever been on it. And you save so much time by practicing it on a simulator before you get there, because the cost of a simulator is basically zero. Now, what is the general setup for a simulator? Well, you can buy a Logitech G 290. It used to be the G25, and then I think they had like G29 or 27 or something like this. It's like $250 on Amazon. You can probably find a link down in the description. And you get a video game, so Gran Turismo is like $50, or Assetto Corsa. They're all pretty good. So if you get a steering wheel and a game, that's about $300 total, and you can drive that for pretty much for all of eternity. Now, if you want to be more serious about sim racing, iRacing is definitely the way to go. So iRacing is a subscription-based model, but basically has the best online racing and most realistic racing experience you could find. It's basically you can race with other people, and they're very strict about the rules, so it really forces you the right habits about, obviously don't punt someone off the track, but also like try to keep all the wheels onto the track, and also like make sure that you're taking the driving in the simulator very seriously. So iRacing I recommend iRacing to everyone if you want to learn about if you want to take sim racing very seriously. And I think it's like $100 a year, and I think that there's also more of a cost to get the cars and tracks that you want. So that'll add, let's say, like another $100 to the cost. And after that, I recommend getting a seat. It's like a racing seat. There are plenty of them made of play seat or other ones, or you can also build your own. Those are about $300. And if you want to go really high end, you could also buy like a nicer wheel and brake setup. So the benefits of having a more expensive wheel and brake setup is that you'll get a better feeling, especially on the brakes. It'll feel more realistic and more hydraulic rather than like a plasticky feel. Those range anywhere from like $1,000 to $2,000, and obviously you can get the ones that are like motion sensors and things like this. But the basic setup I found was sufficient for me, and so $300 for a wheel, $300 for a seat, and $200 for iRacing, I think is probably the best way to go, and you could just drive that for years and years. So the next section I'm going to talk about actual physical cars, so go-karting, cars, and everything they like. And the biggest thing about physical things that you buy is that they depreciate over time, and I think my general assumptions for everything is that you'll drive 40 track hours a year, and you'll drive about, at the life of each car is going to be about 200 track hours. Now, obviously, some cars, like road cars, are going to last a bit longer, and other race cars are going to last a bit shorter. But I think for the purposes of comparison, it's probably a good estimate. And also, yeah, it's easy enough for me to kind of work out the numbers this way. Also, I think a really important metric that I used and when we used to calculate what was worth it in terms of making something seem cheap or expensive, comparing each other, was we use a per hour cost. So rather than using a per day cost, which is what a lot of people do, spending a day in a go-kart, you spend a lot more time in a go-kart than you do than a racing car. And depending on the racing car and depending on the series, sometimes you get more track time per day than others. And so rather than talking about per day, we generally try to use it per hour cost. And that's also really nice because the general per hour costs are going to be somewhat relatable between cars. So first up, I'm going to talk about karting. Karting is the basics of driving, and pretty much every professional driver has began their career in karting at a young age, or even older people started karting at an older age, and that's what I did. So I spent all of 2013, like a whole year, doing go-karts, and it's basically the best way to go racing. Now I'm going to talk about three main forms of karting. So the first one's rental karts. So everyone's done this probably. You go to a kart facility and you pay them, I don't know, $30, and you get to drive it for 10 minutes and around the track, and that's really fun. Obviously that's one way to go, but they also have one thing that's really nice is that they have rental kart leagues. You pay, I think, like $90, you get a qualifying, and then you get 2 races, and that's a really good format because you get to go wheel racing without having to have too much commitment, and you get to have a lot of fun. And at the end of the day, that's really all of this is all about. And so overall, these end up costing, we'll put the number down as $125 per track hour. And yeah, it seems pretty, well, it's not cheap, but when we keep looking at the next 3 ones, it will start looking cheaper and cheaper compared to some options. The next step above the rental kart is buying your own racing kart. And the most common kart league in, at least the budget kart league in the US, is the 206, or basically the Briggs & Stratton 206 motor. It's basically like a lawn mower motor that's been upgraded by like 2 horsepower, and it's basically used because it has reliability. I don't know anyone that's had too many problems with their motor. The motor itself is like $800, and so it's really supposed to be a really cost-effective way to go racing. And as I break down the cost, you'll see that it's quite good. The great thing about these karts is that this is like the chassis that they use and everything else is a pure racing car. Like the only difference between a kart and a car is that generally these karts only have real wheel braking, and they also don't have any suspension. But other than that, these are purebred racing cars. And so when you start driving them, you'll get a high level performance, even for a 206, which has like 10 horsepower. Now, the cost of a kart with a 206 motor is generally about $5,000 for a new one. You can get a used one for around $2,500. And what these bring as well is that you definitely should get one that has a data system. So all of them, I think, now use Micron 5, and Micron is made by the same people that make like the AIM systems. And so you'll start getting integrated into the being able to use car data, and that's also really important, especially if you want to get better as a driver. So 206 kart costs about $5,000. The great thing about these series is that they're really budget sensitive, and so they generally all use hard tires, and that's about $500 for a set of tires a year. So that's quite nice. Aside from that, you'll need a helmet. Because it's a go-kart, you don't need a fireproof helmet, so you can use a motorcycle helmet, which is like $100. You get some gloves. It's about $10 an hour for gas. They don't consume that much gas because, again, it's a lawnmower engine. You'll have to pay about $400 a year for a season pass at your local kart track, and it's probably costs around $800 depending on where you store it to store that kart for the year. You'll probably pay around, let's say, $20 for an oil change, and then maybe you'll replace the clutch, like 50 to 100 hours in. Other than that, that's pretty much it. These karts are extremely reliable. You also probably need to change the gears and the chain every once in a while, but the cost of those are like $20 for maybe every 20 hours, so it's basically like $1 an hour. I basically added up all the costs, and on the conservative side, assuming that you drive 40 hours a year, you'll pay somewhere around $100 an hour for the 206 cart. Now, a lot of that cost is from the depreciation of the cart, and also the storage and the practice pass. And that's one of the greatest things about the 206 is that the cost to drive it every hour after you pay the fixed cost is like $50 an hour. It's cheaper than renting a go-kart. And that's why, when I started, I don't even know how many hours I drove my cart, maybe over 100 hours in the summer. And that was awesome. You would just go there, drive all day. We take the day off of work, and then, on a weekday, like no one's at the kart track. So you can just literally spend however long you want at the track. And the cost of these carts is so low that, yeah, it's cheaper than renting a go-kart at a arrive, at your local kart track. So I highly recommend 206 for anyone that really wants to or is interested in racing and really wants to be a bit more serious than just like renting a go-kart. The next step above a 206 cart is something like a tag, or what they call like a touch and go cart. So I'm going to use Rotax Max as the example because that's something I'm familiar with and also something that's quite popular. Now, the difference between a Rotax and a 206 cart is that the engine it's much faster. I think it's got like 27 horsepower compared to 10. So the acceleration is unbelievable. And also the tires are going to be much softer. So now instead of using a hard tire, you're going to start using soft tires. And the difference between a soft tire and a hard tire is that a hard tire can last even like 20-40 hours, while a soft tire is going to last you something like 2 hours to 4 hours in terms of like performance. They're much more sticky than a hard tire, but they degrade much faster. And so when you go from the 206 to the Rotax, you're making a huge jump in performance. Now, people say this all the time, which is that you're not going to find a similar level of performance to a Rotax or like a really fast go-kart until you get to something like Formula 3 or even faster, because the power to weight ratio and also the grip, the pure mechanical grip that you have from these tires is so high that you're not going to find them again. Even in a lower formula, like they're just much slower than a go-kart. So the engine is not as reliable. The engine is also more expensive, and the tires especially are more expensive. So the engine, you have to rebuild the top every 25 hours and the whole engine every 50 hours. And that's around like $2,000 for both of those. And the tires are, let's say, $500 per set, but because they only last, I think, 2 to 4 hours, you're going to spend a lot more in tire cost. So, totaling all the costs, the other costs are basically the same. You still have to pay for the engine oil and the maintenance of the engine, but the biggest differences in cost are going to be the tires and the engine. And totaling those up, it's about 20 hours an hour for gas, $250 an hour for tires, $50 an hour from engine maintenance, and so everything added up, it's about $300 of variable cost per hour, and then also adding the other fixed costs of like the car itself and also the and also adding in all the variable costs and fixed costs from owning the car and the storage costs. It's about $365 an hour. Now, that sounds like quite a lot, which it is, but the amount of performance that you get out of a Rotax is extremely high. And you can also stretch the tire budget quite a bit. Like you could, instead of running each tire set for 2 hours, you could run it for 4. But the performance of the tires really drops off. So that really depends on where you are in terms of how competitive you are and also how fast you want to go. And that'll affect really the running costs of running a Rotax quite a bit. But yeah, you can see based on just the cost itself, it's like basically 3.5 times more expensive than a 206, but you also get a much higher leap in performance. So that's something to think about. So the next section I wanted to go into is about cars. So this is where things get fun. I drove a Porsche and a Lexus IS on the track. I've also driven some other friends' cars, and I want to kind of share with you a generic example of what I think a car tracking a normal car on track would cost. And I think this is probably information that most of you would want to know, especially if you haven't driven on the track that much, or if you're just looking into, hey, like I'm kind of interested in maybe going a little bit, like changing to a different car. What are the difference in costs, or what are they going to be? So for the examples of this, I'm just going to use a 2018 BRZ. I think they're generally about, I looked online, they're about $22,000 for a 2018 BRZ. The nice thing about that is that it's still under warranty. So, if something catastrophic happens, you could probably get it repaired by the manufacturer. And aside from the stock car, you're also going to need brake pads, brake fluid, and tires. Now, the stock brake pads, they're just not going to cut it. And the stock tires, they're just not going to cut it either. Also, it's very important for you to get brake fluid, because the brake, especially on track driving, the normal brake fluid is going to boil, and then you're not going to have brakes anymore. So generally, I looked online, a set of tires for the BRZ is going to cost you somewhere between $400 to $800 per set. For the purpose of this, I want to go for performance, so I chose the Yokohama AD08R. It's about $800 for a set of tires, and they'll last you around 4 days, which I'm going to contribute to 8 hours of hard driving. Now, I know some of you might stretch those tires out for a bit longer than 4 days, but for the purposes of this video, I think we're going to really use them as hard as we can. And there's also really good sponsorship deals for the 86 as well. I know GT Radial has tires on sale. Those I think are like $200 a set, and it's a really, really good deal. But for this video, I kind of want to make it comparable to other cars you're also going to be driving. One thing I haven't really covered, and especially when we start talking about cars, is that the faster you drive, the harder you're going to wear the components. So especially the tires, but also the suspension and everything else. The faster you drive, the more G's you put on them, and the degradation really starts increasing much more rapidly than you would expect. So if you're really driving on the limit all the time, you're going to burn through sets of tires very, very quickly. But if you're driving let's say 7/10, 8/10, even 9/10, it's going to almost double the life of your components. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to try to assume that you're going to be driving 10/10 or 9 or 10/10 all the time. But you could definitely, track driving is also a lot cheaper if you just go a little bit nicer on the car. Especially also cool down laps and all those things help the car out quite a bit as well. So for the BRZ, you're going to need brake fluid every year. That's going to be about $50 to $200 depending on whether you change it yourself or you hire someone to do it for you. You're also going to need engine oil every 4 days, or 4 track days. So that's going to be somewhere between $50 to $250 depending on whether you have a mechanic do it for you or you do it yourself. Aside from that, you're going to need to replace the brake rotors every year. And those will be about $400 to $700, and you're also going to need to replace the pads around every 4 track days. So that's going to be $150 to $400. I'll try to have 2 different costs. One for whether you can work on the car yourself, and the other one whether you hire someone to do it for you. Outside of tires, brakes, and engine oil, there's not really that much you have to worry about. That's why I think the BRZ is such a great car. You don't have to worry about, you don't generally have to worry about too many things. If something does break, it is under warranty, and it's a really good handling car, and it really teaches you how to drive. So if we want to add up all the costs, now the other sort of costs we have to think about is track days. So how much gas is it going to cost for you to drive to and back from the track day? What are the track fees? Also, what is the hotel fees going to cost you? When I was driving at different tracks around the world, I would have to rent a hotel. Sometimes I have to buy a plane ticket. Obviously, for this purposes, we're going to be driving there. But the costs are really different depending on which tracks you go to. Now, I'm going to assume that track fees are going to be about $250 a day. The hotels, maybe you have a hotel every 4 track days because you go somewhere really far away. And gas is going to cost you, let's say, $50 per track hour for getting there and coming back. And obviously, it's going to be a bit different based on the further or how close you are. So adding everything up, hopefully you can see it over here. If you can work on the car yourself, a BRZ should cost you around $300 an hour to work on it yourself, and it should cost you about $400 per hour if you pay someone else to do it. Now, also including the depreciation of the car and also the car cost, it's somewhere around $500 per hour of track time. Now, This is a bit more expensive than the Rotax, but it is a car, right? And cars obviously are going to be bigger. It's going to be a bit faster on a large track. And yeah, it's a very different experience. And I would say at $500 per hour, that's about the base cost for track driving. And I think a BRZ is probably one of the cheapest cars that anyone could ever drive on a track. And you know, like you could, if you really kind of like fiddle with the numbers, you know, and do things yourself, you could really get that number down to something like, you know, $200 an hour. You know, if you stretch the tires a little bit longer, if you do more work yourself, and yeah, if you're just nicer on the car, the cost of tracking that really goes much lower. Now, let's say, you know, you want to drive a faster car, you want to have something more sporty. So let's replace the BRZ with a C7. So I looked online, the cost for a 2018, 2017 C7 is around $50,000. And, you know, just on the car cost alone, it's a difference of like $30,000. And $30,000 divided by 200 track hours is still going to be like $150 an hour. So just based on the car depreciation alone, it's going to be a relatively large cost. And after that, the largest cost is going to be the tires and brakes. So the tires on a C7 cost about $1,600 for a set. So about almost double that of the BRZ, and you know, could be even more than double if you, depending on which tire to choose, and just because of the diameter and the size of the tire. Now the Corvette tires are, I think, 20-inch, and yeah, they're quite wide as well, so you're going to have more sticky rubber. It is a heavier car, so you should also expect to wear down these components at a faster rate than you would the BRZ. But for the purposes of this, I think we're going to just use the same amount of time for the life of each of these components. Another thing as well is that the brake pads, brake rotors, they're a bit more expensive. They're not significantly more expensive. It also does consume a bit more fuel. So everything is a little bit more expensive on the C7. And that's how you get a cost over here, which is about $600 per hour for a mechanical cost, and $850 per hour, including the cost of the car. So if you look at it, it is about 50% more expensive than driving a BRZ. And yeah, I mean, with that, you get way more horsepower. You get almost, you know, 450 horsepower, and you get a much faster car. But again, with the faster car, it costs more money to run, and you'll kind of see that as we keep going. Okay, so let's talk about race cars. So I have some familiarity with race cars. I've been driving them since 2014, I think. I started driving Formula Mazda in 2014, and I did about 1 year Formula Mazda. And so Formula Mazda is a really good car. It's basically designed in the 1980s, 1990s, and it's a single-seater open-wheel car, but it's quite old, so they're relatively cheap, and they're extremely reliable. They use like the old RX-7 motor, and those motors last generally a decent amount of time, and also replacing them is quite cheap. And because it's such a light car, I think they're about like 1,200 pounds, they wear the components out a little bit less. So, you know, for the Mazda, the car itself is about $20,000. The engine and transmission will probably get rebuilt every 50 hours, and that's about $8,000. So for there's about $80 per hour. The gas is about the same as like a racing, you know, as you would expect from a racing car. The tires, so the great thing about these tires is that you can buy relatively cheap Hoosier tires. They're about $800 for a set of 4, and they'll last you about 2 days. You know, it depends on your mileage and depending on how fast you go. Some people can stretch them out a bit longer. Some people can't even get more than 1 day out of the tires. It really depends on who you are. You also now, because you started riding a race car, you probably are going to have some help. So whether you have your friend help you out or you have hired a race team, I put down about $75 of race prep per hour. Yeah, other than that, you have brake pads, engine oil, all pretty much the same thing, like pretty much the normal things. And because this is a much lighter car, it's only about $100 per corner for all of these different for pads, for rotors. So it's much cheaper, but you know, all those things you still need to replace relatively frequently because of the high performance of the car. Lastly, we have suspension and track fees. And so, you know, the suspension doesn't generally break on these cars that often, but you will need to rebuild them every so often. But the great thing is that they're pretty cheap. Put down $3,000 for 50 hours. Track fees, same as everything else. Yeah, adding storage fees and everything, the Formula Mazda is going to cost you somewhere around like $800 to $900 per track hour, which if you think about the performance is a relative bargain. For the experience, for the performance, it is an open wheel car, and it's extremely fast. So around Autobahn, we have had a lot of different cars on the track. It's faster than GT3 cars on the north and south track. It's faster than like a Porsche Cup car on the north and south track, and at the cost that you're getting, it's just unbelievable value. And not just that, I would say the Formula Mazda is a great car for you to learn in terms of about how to drive with a mechanical grip, because the lighter the car, it's very similar to a go-kart but bigger in that it's basically just the four wheels. It does have wings, but they do something, but they're not that good. And so it really teaches you how to drive to the limits of a car. It's a very simple car. There's no ABS, there's no traction control. It's just you, four tires, and the track. And I really enjoyed my time in the Formula Mazda. And I think for anyone that really wants to drive and learn how to drive at a very high level and a high level performance, it's the best bargain that you could ever get. So the next thing I'll talk about is the Radical SR3. So this is what I've been driving for the last 3 years. It's a really good car. It's really fast, and it's fast because of its aero. So it has quite a lot of downforce, and you'll see that in some of our videos where basically we're going through corners. So at Autobahn, the south track, there's one corner which is a high downforce corner. And in let's say the BRZ, I would go through South 4 around 75 miles an hour. In a Spec Miata, maybe around 80 miles an hour. In the Formula Mazda, I think it goes around 90 something miles an hour, just because it has a bit of downforce. And in the Radical, you're going to go through there around 115 miles an hour. So it has a lot of downforce. The engine itself is not that powerful. The ones that we use at the track is 1340. It's basically a 1.3 liter Hayabusa engine. The national races, they use the 1.5 liter, but we try to use the smaller engine because it lasts longer, lasts like twice as long. And so it saves us some money. And that's kind of how we think about a lot of things, is that we want to race, but we also want to save a little bit of money here as we can. So the car itself, the Radical itself is around 110,000 US dollars. I think it fluctuates based on the currency, but it's around $110,000. And basically, you also need to do probably some of these services every once in a while. So the engine and trans needs to be rebuilt, let's say every 50 hours. So it's about $200 a cost an hour. The uprights, they'll break all the time, especially if you go over the curbs. That's, let's say, $6,000 for 40 hours. The suspension also needs to be rebuilt every 40 hours. You're going to need tires, and unfortunately the tires for these cars are a lot more expensive. They're about $1,600 for a set, but they will last you a bit longer than the ones on the Formula Mazda. So the tires are about $400 per hour. The brake pads, engine oil, engine fluid, all of those are about the same cost as Formula Mazda, just because these are really small and light cars. The Radical itself, I think, is like 1,300 pounds. Brace prep is about $125 an hour. The track fees, about the same. Storage fees, about the same. So the biggest differences in terms of cost are going to be the engine, the uprights, the suspension, and the tires. And so that really raises the cost of this car. It is a much higher performance car than the Formula Mazda, but that does also mean that like when something does break, it's going to cost a lot more money. And so all of these added together, the Radical calculated is about $1,400 to $1,500 an hour without car depreciation. And you can really see, because it's a much more expensive car, if you hit something or something goes wrong, it raises the cost to about $2,000 an hour, which is in my experience around about right. But it is a much higher performance car, and with that costs quite a bit more money. So lastly, I wanted to give a small brief on pro racing. I'll probably make a larger video about pro racing sometime in the future, but basically pro racing is internationally sanctioned events, or basically nationally sanctioned events. So I did one race in Formula 4 in China, and I did one national race, and there's a huge difference in cost between pro racing and amateur or just open lapping. And that's because the events themselves are more expensive, like race fees are more expensive. And also, because a lot of them require people to travel, there's a huge cost for the logistics. If you think about it, you're basically not just flying there yourself, but you're also going to be flying or driving your whole race team with you, and they're going to be helping you work on the car, and they're going to prepare you, and also you'll have like a driver coach, you'll have race engineers, and so all of these things added together really increase the price of racing when you think of the difference between pro racing and amateur racing. So I don't really have the exact breakdown for all these costs. I'll probably put them in a future video, but as a general, these are the kind of like arrive and drive costs for a season that I've been quoted. So for Formula 4, now this is in the US, this is in China. In the US, it would probably be, let's say, 50% to 100% more expensive than this. So in China, like the whole season would be $100,000 for 6 race weekends. That includes 1 set of tires, and that doesn't include the practice days. So if you include practice days and an extra set of tires, let's make I figure around $115,000 to $120,000 for 6 weekends. That's about 4 hours driving per weekend, and 6 weekends. It's around $4,000 to $5,000 an hour for Formula 4, which is supposed to be like the budget pro racing option. Now for Formula Renault, it's basically the weekend formulas, the weekend schedules are basically the same, but the car is higher performance. It's basically a step between Formula 4 and Formula 3, and for 6 weekends it's about $160,000, or basically $6,500 per hour. And for Radical Cup, it's generally around about $20,000 per race, so somewhere between the cost of a Formula 4 and Formula Renault. And obviously, there's also Indy Pro, USF 2000, and all of those are, going to be somewhere, between the $200,000 to $400,000 per year type of deals. But they also have more races than 6. I think they have like 8 or 9 races. So, generally pro racing is going to cost you somewhere between $4,000 and $4,000 is probably on the very, very low end. And realistically, it's somewhere around like $6,000 per track hour. Now, obviously, there's also these are quite different events. Some of them are going to be with the Formula 1 team, so it's a very unique experience. But yeah, the pro racing is obviously just a very, very different level than everything else that we talked about. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope this was enlightening to you. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to you about them. And yeah, I just wanted to say, like, obviously these are just numbers based on my own experience, and also based on like my own driving styles and habits. Obviously, if you can work on the car yourself, if you can drive it a little bit nicer on the cars, you can save some costs. And also, some people get unlucky, they crash their cars. I haven't really gone into that part yet, but every time that I crash my car, obviously there's a large repair bill. And there's also, people, you could get unlucky with the engine. So there's a lot of variables at hand. So I don't want to say like, oh, this is for sure how much you're going to pay, but this is about how much I would expect to pay for driving these types of cars onto the track. And I hope that can help enlighten you, especially if you're making a decision between, oh, I want to drive, let's say, a go-kart, this kart, or this go-kart, or maybe this car. And out of all these different things, hopefully I've given you good different options about what you should look into and what could fit your budget. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.